Good morning, you're watching Sky News Breakfast and time for another dive into the newspapers. With me here is political correspondent at the online publication Ava Santina Evans and the deputy editor at Conservative Home, Henry Hill. Very good morning to you both again. And we're starting, Ava, with the story of the day, really, which is this return of imperial units, which could have been more widespread, has largely been scrapped other than in one little focused area.
Yeah, so there's two parts to this story. So over the Christmas period, Rishi Sunak and the Treasury, they have announced that they've abandoned Boris Johnson's pledge to bring back imperial measurements. I mean, it wasn't a particularly popular initiative that they wanted to bring back. It was supposed to be this big Brexit bonus. Now that we're not in the common market, we can deal in pints, pounds, and I don't know, shillings, perhaps, if you'd like that. But, you know, they've decided after looking at the polling that showed that nearly 99% of people didn't really care or didn't really want it, that they would scrap it. However, we are apparently going to get back a pint of alcohol. So you might be able to go to the supermarket soon or to pubs and buy a pint of champagne or a pint of wine. And this apparently was what Winston Churchill always advocated for. Apparently he loved a pint of champagne because it meant he could have 2 glasses at lunch and 1 at dinner. So we'll be drinking like Winston Churchill again, apparently.
Well, I know that part of it I like, but the rest of it does sound a bit silly. And Henry, the question here, for all the political debate and the ties to Brexit and the promises from certain sides about this, if this government polling, which has sort of been referred to, is right, nobody wanted this, so it makes sense to massively scale it back.
I mean, my personal view is that you should, if you want to retail things in imperial, you should be allowed to. I don't think there's a particularly compelling case for that being illegal. But yeah, simultaneously, I grew up in the metric age. I probably couldn't do the mental arithmetic necessary to do the necessary conversions now if I were buying in pounds and ounces. So it was never going to be a huge vote winner in the way that a few people seem to think it would. But on the other hand, it's a perfectly harmless bit of deregulation. You know, now we're no longer in the European Union. If you could do it, I don't really see why you shouldn't.
Let's move on to your first pick on this section. Rwanda processed only 0.5% of asylum claims in 6 months. Talk us through what this article is particularly getting at. Of course, the implications for the government are clear.
Yeah, so this is a report that Rwanda in 2022 didn't even manage to break triple figures in the number of asylum claims that it processed. It only managed to do about 90-something, apparently. And obviously, this is a big concern for the government because the whole point of the Rwanda scheme is that people who come to the UK illegally will, in theory, be sent to Rwanda, have their asylum claim processed there, and then potentially end up sort of, in Rwanda if that claim is upheld. Now, a big question about that is about the practicalities of whether or not Rwanda can actually deliver this scheme. The government has already spent hundreds of millions of pounds trying to get Rwanda into a place where it can do that, so maybe that money will have made a difference, but it is nonetheless a sign of how difficult the government is going to find it, because again, all of the legal challenges are about the practicalities. The Rwanda scheme has been ruled legal in principle by the Supreme Court, but time and again the government has fallen down because the judges have not been convinced that Rwanda is in a place where it can practically and safely oversee the scheme, and this is even more evidence of that. The UN on the ground in Rwanda has processed many times as many applications as the Rwandan government itself.
Ava, run into the end of this year, it feels like it was the only story of domestic politics that we were talking about. Do you think it will dominate to the same extent next year as well?
Yes, I think that the Conservatives, well, particularly Rishi Sunak, is hell-bent on getting this policy through. But, I mean, what will be fascinating to see is once it has been approved by the Supreme Court, whether the plan is workable, and obviously it is not. And just to be clear, this policy will mean that asylum seekers who arrive in the UK will be sent to Rwanda and then they will stay in Rwanda. It's not a processing system that means that they might come back and be offered safe haven in the UK. It means they will be forced to stay there. But look, it's an incredibly expensive policy, and right at a time where we're looking at even more war in the world and climate change affecting certain parts of the world, and people are on the move. This is not the sort of policy we should be looking at. Labour are perhaps potentially going to give us something interesting in the new year, where they're talking about offering asylum claims in other countries, so you'll be able to apply for safe passage before you come here. That is much more workable than this ridiculous proposal.
Well, we'll see if we get further details and the practicalities of it from the Labour side in due course. What's the next story, Eva, you've picked out? It relates to this National Trust warning that, in fact, we had a guest on from National Trust earlier as well.
Yeah, so this is that climate change is upsetting Britain's natural order. So because of, there are less cold snaps, it means that we've got a new Mediterranean moth, which is attacking our trees. It also means that if you're in a coastal town, you might be experiencing more turbulent weather, and also animals are coming out of hibernation early. But look, this is a really interesting story because, as you know, we've been talking about going into the election next year, and we've been talking about how housing will be at the top of billing. The environment is one of those policies that is really important to voters. It's right at the top of their concerns when they're going to choose their next leader in the ballot box. And what's also fascinating about this is the National Trust are talking about how it's the climate change is making certain parts of the country hotter, certain parts of the country less wet. It means that there could be huge moves in how we're producing food. I mean, the Champagne region, for one, in France, might be moving to the south of England. We might now see the Champagne region in Kent because it's too hot in France.
Well, and using new size bottles as well, as we discussed earlier. It was a really interesting article, that, as well, and it was an interesting story about the winners and losers in terms of species that the National Trust is looking at this year. Henry, on to your next story, and it relates to another topic we talked a lot about in the late part of last year, but HS2, and what's this Express story picking out?
Yeah, so this is part of the sort of post-mortem for HS2, and this is a claim that an alternative proposal that was put forward by a group called High Speed UK could have saved the government tens of billions of pounds because it would have saved money versus the HS2 scheme we actually got. Now, there are going to be an awful lot of these post-mortems, and the reason that I've sort of wanted to highlight this one is that most of this stuff lets politicians off the hook, right? Because the idea here is that you have two claims, and HS2, the one we picked, ended up being more expensive for various reasons that weren't to do with the government. That's completely wrong. In fact, one, you couldn't tell. The initial estimates for HS2 were a complete fiction and had to be, because they couldn't even access the land to survey the route until the bill had been passed, the bill allowing them to do it, and they had to produce an estimate before the bill was passed. But also MPs added thousands of additional requirements to HS2 during the process of that legislation, all of which padded the cost. So we actually have no idea what this alternative scheme would have ended up costing for various reasons. But I think it's important that voters remember, whatever they think of HS2, the reason it got so expensive was not just HS2 Limited being, a bad company or whatever. It was politicians making lots of very bad decisions, which added to the final bill.
Henry and Eva, thanks so much for that part of the paper review. We'll see you again shortly.